Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation from the organizers. The paper I'm presenting today is with my co-author, Josh Mason, and it's entitled Distribution and Household Debt. We focus on debt partly because in some sense it's one of the key macroeconomic issues of our time, as we know from the last 2 days of discussions. There's been this whole set of debates about the public debt, rising public debt, its implications for fiscal stimulus, the ability to actually stimulate more versus austerity. And then there's been for a long time, at least for the last 2 years, the whole discussion about balance sheet recessions and what governments should do in response to highly leveraged households and so on. Most recently, I think, more recently, there has been an interest in private debt. Of course, this has been an interest among some people for a long time, for example, Wynne Godley and others. But this new interest in private debt, and particularly household debt, I think is very welcome, and it has brought together people who would normally not would probably otherwise be somewhat strange bedfellows, Koo, Egerton, Krugman, Godley, and Keene, together all trying to understand the implications of private debt, and particularly household debt. I think it's important because if you take a look at this picture, which is drawn directly from the flow of funds in the US, household debt is by far the largest component of gross debt in the US. And it's really been on a sort of upward trend since the 1980s. Leverage has been on an upward trend since the 1980s. And what most people are concerned about right now is the uptick in the black line, which is federal government debt. But in some sense, the precursor to this was the indebtedness of households. And in discussing this, there is a distribution angle which people have spoken about and have written quite a bit about. And it's broadly the argument that household debt has gone up since the 80s specifically as a response to stagnant wages. So as you see households falling behind, at least in the middle part of the distribution, they've taken on debt to paper over the difference. And this work by Stiglitz and Fitoussi Saraceno, who speak about this, really nice work by Cinnamon and Fazari, which talks about the customary standard of living, and others. And to perhaps plug the work of my co-panelist, Kumar Fernandes, take a similar perspective, and they formalized this in their 2010, very nice 2010 paper. There's a variation on this argument also by Raghuram Rajan, where the argument is broadly that it was a response to political economy pressures which arose because of this rising inequality, and that pushed the government to actually increase credit to the household sector. Now, I think all of these have some merit, and we really need to figure out more carefully the empirics of how these things worked out, because there are clearly some missing parts of the discussion there. But I think one particular analytical prism, which has been there for a long time, has not been sufficiently appreciated. And this is the perspective from, if you want to call it, the functional distribution of income. Especially the idea that has been developed over many years, I think by a whole host of post-Keynesians and Caloreans and Marxians, that what really distinguishes the period after 1980 is a change in the institutional structure of the US, which really changed the game in terms of increasing the returns to the ownership of financial capital, but financial capital in particular, relative to labor. And returns to ownership of financial assets is called broadly, one might call it the rentier share. This is a term that's coined by Gerald Epstein, among others. And the argument is broadly that because you had things like interest rate deregulation, increased capital mobility, very direct attack on the political power of labor, as well as a very strong, and this is very important, a very strong commitment to disinflation that really changed the game in terms of increasing returns to financial capital. Now, whatever else you may think about whether the story is, this narrative is is convincing in terms of the political economy story, there can be no doubt that it's certainly been the case that returns to ownership of financial capital have grown much faster than labor earnings. And really, the break starts around the 1980s. What you're seeing is an index that I've created, which starts in about 1950. It's derived from the flow of funds account. And it asks the following question: how much have returns, real returns, from the ownership of capital, which is interests, dividends, and realized capital gains, changed relative to returns to labor? And you can see around 1980, there's a real divergence between these two groups. And what you might call the rentier share of income has grown as a result of this. Now, of course, this is, I should say that maybe a little misleading, because labor income is, of course, much larger than rentier income as a whole, but the rates of growth have changed dramatically. And I want to also suggest that that there is a link that is not yet fully understood, and certainly I do not understand it completely, between the rentier share of income and the income share of the top 1%, or the top 0.1%. This is something that I'd like to kind of shout out to the YSI Commons, who had this question up when I went and saw them yesterday, which said, what is behind the rise of the 0.1%? I think a worthwhile hypothesis would be that this changing functional distribution of income is one of the key elements in this. What this shows you is the relationship between the logged rentier share of income, the rentier share of GDP, versus the log income of the top 0.1% between 1986, which is when the Reagan tax reforms came in, and 2007. And this is a very strong positive relationship. By the way, this relationship does not exist in the period before. If I put up the other scatter plot, you wouldn't see anything. It's there in differences. So I think it's worthwhile to think that there is something in these political economy processes which feed into both a functional distribution approach and a personal income inequality approach. Now, how does this functional approach relate to debt? I think one of the things that we tend to do when we speak about household debt is to confuse two very different and both very important sources of increasing leverage. There's two ways that a household can increase leverage. The simplest way that I think most people recognize is increased borrowing. Right? Now, the interesting part is that when we talk about US household debt, we assume, at least it has been assumed, that it is basically increased household borrowing. But there is another element which is very important to the evolution of household sector debt, which is what Josh and I have termed Fisher dynamics, after Irving Fisher's description of a similar process during the Great Depression. And Fisher dynamics really refers to what you might say are the mechanical effects of changes in interest rate, growth rates, and inflation rates on the leverage ratio. And that's independent of whether there's increased borrowing or not. And it's fairly intuitively obvious. When you think about a household where they do not change their stock of debt between one period and another, that is, there's no new borrowing from the financial markets. Well, imagine now that there's some sort of shock which increases the interest payments of the household, and that shock is larger than the increase in wages in that period. Then, regardless of what's happening to their borrowing, their leverage will be going up, right? And there's a possible correlation here between what I showed you before and household debt for this reason. It is possible that you could have increasing rentier income, increased rentier income over and above labor income, and you might be capturing some of the rise in leverage precisely because of this process, right? That is the Fisher dynamics as opposed to increased borrowing. So really the meat of our paper, Josh and my paper, is to try and separate these effects, to try and see empirically whether we can separate these effects and see how important Fisher dynamics, as opposed to purely just new net borrowing, impacted leverage in the US. And we found, using data all the way from 1929 to 2011, that it is actually a very important component of rising leverage, household leverage. And perhaps most interestingly, between 1980 and now, most of the rise, well, actually, between 1980 and 2000, most of the rise came not from increased borrowing, and you saw that leverage was going up, not from increased borrowing, but almost entirely from Fisher dynamics. Now, it should be emphasized that between 2000 and 2006, the story that we know, the conventional story is actually right. That is, households started to borrow enormous amounts between 2000 and 2006. But between 2006 and 2010, as I will show you, they've actually paid down, or at least their obligations have gone down by about the same amount. But this has done nothing or very little to change the leverage ratios in the economy. So how do we do this? Well, we take what is sometimes been termed the least controversial equation in macroeconomics. That's saying something. And we apply it, as we want to do, to perhaps a more controversial area, or not a very common area, which is to take basically the equation for the evolution of the national debt, which has been examined by many, many people, and to split it up into its components. That is a primary deficit, and while we don't normally speak about the primary deficit of the household, you can take it as being net new borrowing of the household, which is equivalent functionally to the primary deficit for a government. And of course, the rest of the elements in this decomposition are very well known: the nominal interest rate, the growth rate of incomes in this case, and inflation. And if you look at our paper, we can quite reasonably operationalize this using the flow of funds data that are available in the US and NEPA accounts when certain things are missing. And we also use data from Raymond Goldsmith to go back before 1945 to actually look at what has happened in that period in order to get a feeling for what happened during the Great Depression. This is perhaps the key diagram that I'd like you to absorb, and if there's one thing to absorb from the talk, and that is to look at three eras and look at the contribution of leverage of each one of these elements in these three eras. The red bars refer to the contribution to leverage coming from increased primary deficits. The blue bars refer to that coming from the contribution of debt dynamics, which is changes in the real interest rate relative to the income growth rate. And the black line refers to changes in the leverage. So whenever debt to income ratio. So whenever the black line is above the graph, there's been an increase in the leverage ratio, and when it's below, there's deleveraging happening in the household. When the red lines are above the axis, it suggests that the household was running primary deficits, which is that they were borrowing from the household sector. And when it's below, they were actually running primary surpluses, which is they were lending to the household sector. I mean, to the financial sector. What I'd like you to take a look at is the period 1980 to 2000, which I have quite unsuccessfully marked with a white circle. And what I want you to take a look at is that the fact that there was really increased leverage more or less through the period, apart from a slight dip in the 1990s, in the early 1990s. But throughout this period, households were not running any deficits in our understanding. They were running surpluses right through a 20-year period of responsible households, if you want to call it that. And that's quite reasonable because you had higher interest rates. It's perfectly in keeping with economic theory what happened in that period. But on the other hand, as you notice, leverage did not decrease and rather increased. And what was the reason for that? That was purely because of higher growth rates of interest relative to the household income, right? The interesting thing to notice is after 2000, you see a different effect. That is, the red bars go all above the axis. Right? And at this part, between 2000 and 2006, you are actually seeing for the first time a reversal in that pattern. That is to say, households are running big deficits, and they're borrowing from the from the financial sector in big time. But even in this period, if you take a look and try and parse out how much is due to Fisher dynamics and how much is due to increased new borrowing, about a third is due to Fisher dynamics. And this might seem a little puzzling because, as we know, interest rates were low during that period. But inflation rates were low, and the growth rate of income was also low, which meant that Fisher dynamics contributed a lot to the rise in leverage. And now if you look at the two other very faintly circled periods, between 2006 and 2010, and I would like to, in a second, compare it to the period between 1929 and 1933, you see that households reverse this process of borrowing that they have undertaken between 2000 and 2006. And in fact, if you add up the primary surpluses, if you want to call it that, between 2006 and 2010, and this includes default, so it's a little bit not completely primary surpluses. It actually is larger than the rise in debt in borrowing between 2000 and 2006. And what's particularly interesting about this period is, yes, you finally have a reduction in the debt to income ratio. But what I think was really fascinating about looking at this period was how closely it resembled the period 1929 to 1933. If you take a look, it's exactly the same dynamics. Households trying desperately to get out from their burden of debt by paying down, but really not being able to deleverage much because of these kind of headwinds coming from interest rates and inflation. And so what's the story from this? Really, the story is that it's very unclear whether you can get too much more from households if you keep constantly hector them now to save more. They are doing it, and they're really pushing at it. But you really see limitations coming in from these Fisher dynamics. How important are the institutional changes between 1980 and 2010? One way to do it is to ask the following question. What if we had the same the same pattern of interest rates, inflation rates, and growth rates in income from 1980 to 2010, that is the same average growth rate, as we did from 1940 to 1980. Of course, this is a counterfactual. What do we find? We find that we would not have this enormous increase in household leverage. In fact, you would probably at the moment be seeing leverage ratios approximately those that you saw in the 50s, which were of course not a cause for alarm. So really a lot is being driven by these Fisher dynamics. A lot of the dynamics in the economy in debt is being driven. Here's another possibly less attractive picture, but I think it's still an indicative picture, trying to divide up how much of these effects are due to following growth rates of income versus following rising real interest payments. And the two figures that you really need to look at are the difference between the thick black line, which is the actual trajectory, and the blue and the red lines. The red line is very similar to the previous red line that I had shown you, and that is trying to take into account all three effects, rising real interest rates and slower rates of growth of income. The blue line is only taking into account changes in the real interest rate. Right? So most of the impact has been because of the real interest rate in this period. And that's actually something that was very surprising to us, but really in keeping with the kind of tradition that I had spoken about, which looked at this as coming out of a change in the factor distribution of income. And I said there's this compelling narrative about a different social structure of accumulation, if you like that language, but really different changes in the political economy with all the things that I've spoken about before, capital mobility, deregulation more broadly, commitments to disinflation, and the relative returns to financial activities have increased accordingly. So to conclude, here's some suggestions that we've had for future work. I think there's some traction to this approach. One cannot understand leverage without understanding Fisher dynamics. And one of the things that I would like to say, which is different from what people have said before, I think that we cannot get away from these distributional tensions. There are distributional tensions between returns to owners of capital, especially financial capital, and owners of labor, and they're critical to understand private debt and macro dynamics. And going forward, in the presence of these Fisher dynamics, at least Josh and I think that there's simply no way of proceeding without some sort of serious notion of debt forgiveness, rather than trying to attempt to deleverage a lot. Thank you very much.
Fascinating paper. Are there direct follow-up questions? Again,
not a discussion on substance, but just the usual clarifying questions, please. I think you can go without a mic. No.
I think so too. Steve Desari. Very interesting work. One, the clarifying question is the primary deficit that you're getting from the flow of funds data. Is that basically a residual? You've got income, you've got interest, you've got these things. Do you solve for that?
Well, it's basically net new borrowing, and you do it through an approach where we take a look at how much outflow there is to the financial sector, and yes, broadly the answer is